Well, hello, welcome to everyone to Arup and this discussion about the circular design futures for aviation. Ellen MacArthur Foundation. This is our chairman, Greg Hodgkinson, with Ellen. We've joined the foundation along with some other major global names with an interest to circular economy. And I was interested to hear that Ellen set up this having sailed around the world and realised that all of the flotsam and jetsam that she saw floating around, and realising that out in the oceans we're affecting the world by dumping stuff that we no longer need. And she compared that with her sailing around the world, where kind of everything was on board and everything that can be recycled was recycled and everything could be reused was reused. And this sort of the idea of how two halves of the world work, her with her little closed environment, and how she managed to survive with that versus what the rest of us are doing, which is throwing stuff away. And so this whole challenge of the circular economy and how it might be used was born, and it's been really fascinating looking at how certain things that we used to dispose of actually now we use and are valuable assets for us, both not just in material terms but also economically. It's really good news. So the challenge today is to think about how might the circular economy be brought into the world of aviation, and as a sort of starting point for that, I've got friends here from our façades division who are thinking, how are façades used in airports? How may they be used in the future? And what benefits, with the circular economy mindset, what benefits might we bring to the aviation community? So we have on the panel here, we have Andy Barnes from Grimshaw. We have Alistair Law from Arup Façades, and Christine Steele, who will take over me very shortly and give you the full agenda for the thing. And welcome to everybody who's on the webinar too. So I'll hand over now to Kristen.
That's great. Thank you very much, Richard. And good afternoon to everybody. Obviously, our guests here in the room with us, but also those on the webinar. The agenda for today is that which you see on the screen. We thought we'd kick off with just a brief introduction to circular economy. What we wanted to talk about more today was putting it into practice. And our chosen area of application is aviation, and we wanted to talk about building facades. That was because it's something that we're interested in and engaged in on a number of projects at the moment. The way we're going to do that is by looking at it through a lens of future worlds. So we're going to imagine some future worlds, and through that look at what sort of responses transpire, design responses and business responses. I'm going to do the first proposition of this is the world, and my colleagues over here, Alistair and Andy, who you've been introduced to, are going to do the response bit. So they've got all the hard work to do. We're going to talk for about 25 minutes, 30 minutes or thereabouts, and then we're going to open up for a discussion within the room. I want to try and bring everything together by about 7 o'clock, so that should give us sort of 30 minutes presentation and 30 minutes conversation. And there's probably an opportunity, well, there is an opportunity as well for those of you who are online to put forward your questions, and I'll come to that in just a moment. So first of all then, circular economy. It's a really interesting space, at least as I see it. But it's also a real challenge. It's a challenge for the built environment, from my perspective, for two real reasons. One, because of scale. At one level, we're working at a regional or city level, or an airport, which is enormous in terms of the assets it's dealing with. And at another level, we're looking at a specific material in a very specific application, and quite possibly the supply chain beneath that. So you have this diversity of scale, and yet at the same time, you have those same materials and those same professionals looking at an airport one day and a housing development the next, and so on and so forth. So we have this complexity that we need to deal with, just as a starter, really. Now, there's a lot of material and a lot of work and a lot of thinking that Alan MacArthur and others have already done in this space in terms of, I guess, helping us along. And there's various schools of thought, that have been around for, quite frankly, decades. Tools like the Resolve framework, outline principles, and diagrams that we're all familiar with. Now, that's all quite conceptual, and really what we wanted to do today was focus in on that area that we've already mentioned, aviation building facades. And hear from Andy and Alistair in terms of what is the design response. So that's going to mean things like the architecture, the material choice, how we combine things, how do we use energy, resources, wastes, and so on. In terms of business, that's a really key part of what circular economy is all about. It's about applying innovation and making more of our resources and generating more value out of that. For our economic systems, for the way we procure, the way we do business. Obviously, aviation, the context in which we're talking about today. We've put together a whole set of slides, and we've tried to bring in examples that we ourselves have worked on. Now, by no means they're all aviation. In fact, there's quite a lot in here that aren't aviation. But we've put them in because A, they make the case, and B, we think they're quite transferable to those sorts of examples that we see in terminal buildings and the facades we apply there. So I talked a little bit a moment ago about a thought experiment. What did I mean by that? Well, we've got these concepts around circular economy, business models, and design responses. The way in which we wanted to try and extend our thinking in those areas was to set out a proposition of 5 future worlds and explore what the responses in those 2 areas would be, listening to Andy and to Alistair. So those 5 future worlds are sort of summarised on this slide. We've got Castaway, passive, DBOM, we've added a D in there to represent end of life and disassembly, the universal building or terminal, and finally scrap heap challenge. So those images give you a little bit of a taster, as do the titles. Later on, I guess I'm going to invite you to make your own interpretations of what they mean, and having listened to our thoughts. And essentially, the plan for the next 20 minutes or so is for me to set a proposition around Castaway in the first instance, and then hear for a couple of minutes from Andy and Alistair as to what their thinking is around what that kind of world might mean in terms of applying circular economy to a building facade in an aviation context. So, without further ado, I have one more slide just before we crack on. If you have a question, as I said, it's quite easy if you're in the room because you can just note it down and you can voice it at the end of the presentation. If you're online, unfortunately we've not got the capacity to kind of do a live feed on on questions online. But if you send it to my email, and we've got someone monitoring those, and we'll do our best to feed those points into the discussion as we get to that point. So the first scenario then. So in this case, in this situation, what I invite you to imagine, I guess, is a situation where in the first instance we can use resource to create our terminal building and our facade. But from that point forward, it's going to operate in isolation. So think of the airport as a closed system. It's going to be very self-sufficient, minimal resource consumption in use. And what's that going to mean in terms of using the asset, the wider asset base that is there on the site and the terminal in terms of the operations of the airport? I would expect there to be very little waste, both in terms of materials, but also energy, water, and so on. There might be something in there in terms of energy generation coming from local or site-based sources. I mean, in terms of materials, I'm not sure, but maybe there's something in there about things being repairable or repurposable over the duration of the service life of that building facade. So, Andy, I invite you to offer your thoughts on that future world.
Great, thanks, Christian. In the Castaway scenario, we think that that you're going to really want long-lasting components, and ideally these will be reconfigurable according to your changing needs over time. This is demonstrated quite well, I think, in a build project of ours, which is the Argus factory in Cologne, which uses a set of standardized reconfigurable panels. And these panels can be upgraded over time, so the cheaper solid panels can be replaced with the more expensive glazed panels as the client can afford them. And this project is one that's been phased through 20 years and expanded through 7 phases. And these panels are completely interchangeable between all of the different phases, so they can move between them. In the Castaway scenario, you might also want to be able to kind of print spare parts when you need them. And for this, we might look towards advanced manufacturing. And it's been a discussion that's been held on quite a few of our recent projects. And there's been a growing interest in this idea of open source design and open source manufacture. And if you think about the advancement of 3D kind of printing technology over the years, it's conceivable that in the future we might have a raw material that's stored and continually configured and reconfigured according to the needs on site. Slightly more radically, you might also want to, well, you'd certainly want to be growing things from what you have immediately around you, and this is a particularly innovative solution that's been created recently. And you can imagine that you will be incorporating multifunctional landscapes into the airport, where you'll be doing water harvesting and recirculation, recycling, but also potentially growing your own building materials. And this is a construction material made from mushrooms. And you can imagine, with the increasing usage of kind of green walls in buildings, that potentially you could imagine that you'll be growing new facades on existing facades.
And in terms of business model, the key question is how you make that work to pay back. So we see a framework agreement with a facade contractor, which is an agreement over perhaps sort of 75 years, and where you have a standardisation and a sharing of components across your airport. So I'm setting the perimeter outside the airport and assuming you're going to have multiple terminals growing, expanding, changing, being refurbished. And that means that kind of standardisation allows a sharing of components. And how do you incentivise a reuse rather than a renew? It's quite clear that the landfill charges have been increasing over time, depending on the type. So we imagine these trends to go forward. We also think that if you can have a set of rates which are agreed at the beginning, which favour the reuse rather than the renew, that design right at the start of that asset will sort of bring that in terms of high quality, ease of flexibility, very much in the terms that Andy discussed. We think this will lead to lower capex. That standardisation and the reuse means not only can you get continuous improvement, but you should get a lower capex for your objects, and hopefully also a lower OPEX, because you'll be reusing components that are kind of stored across your various buildings. And I think the key bit, like all of these, is this long-term contract to make sure that there's really an incentive for people to kind of consider those long periods and how things actually fit together and can be reconfigured. So, yes.
Great, thank you very much. So that's the kind of the setup. Okay, we're going to go through a couple more of those. So the next world that I invite you to imagine is that of, I guess we call it passive, and we're familiar with that term. Passive systems with low energy requirement. We're not maybe thinking too different from that. But is there a component of that is about harvesting energy, harvesting the resources in the immediate surroundings environment of the terminal? Materials will need to be selected quite closely to enable with that passive-based system to work successfully with it. So there's going to be, I guess, could it be a blend of high-tech materials or perhaps low-tech materials? Certainly ones that subscribe to circular economy principles that essentially enable successful recirculation back into a useful source at end of a useful purpose at end of life. So there's a quick description on passive, and Andy, maybe you can give us some thoughts on what that might mean.
Yeah, so we think in the passive world, you're going to need really hard-working, kind of multifunctional facades that are harvesting the kind of natural resources available. And the image that you see on the screen is Arup's algae facade on the big house in Hamburg, and this is a really innovative kind of facade design which uses microalgae to create biomass and heat for energy in the building. And even more kind of cleverly, it's providing dynamic shading, so the more sunlight there is, the more algae that grows, and in turn creating more, reducing solar gains in the building. In the passive world, we think you're also going to want to use materials that have a low environmental impact, and be using materials that are potentially available around you on site, in the ground, or grown, on the previous example shown. And this is a photo that I took last time I went to visit Eden Project. And this is a rammed earth wall, which is in the visitor centre. And it's actually a 45-metre length of rammed earth wall. And if you think about kind of durability, Eden Project gets 1 million visitors a year. In 2010, they had kind of flash floods, and this wall was kind of unaffected by those. So it's extremely durable. And thinking about materials in this way, you also start to think about things like gabion walls and straw bale and timber construction. I think in this world as well, you're going to want your facades to kind of be recirculating what would have been waste flow, and certainly having energy recovery at the facades. And in airports, we know that there's a huge challenge around providing natural ventilation in the terminal buildings. So we might start to imagine kind of air filtering facades. This example that you see on screen is a competition that we did for Zagreb Airport, and in this case, there's a roof plenum, which is providing a low energy ventilation solution for the building, and it's providing kind of recirculation of the air and heat recovery in winter, and allowing exhaust of air in summer through stack effect.
So how do we incentivise the business approach? I see this as a USCO rather than ESCO. Many of you heard about the energy services companies, whereas actually I'm thinking about utility services companies. That this is a company that actually helps design and install that facade. We all know the facade is a filter to that kind of external world, as Andy discussed. So that provides daylight, so it would affect your lighting demand. That controls the U values, therefore your heating demand. And therefore, why shouldn't that utilities provider actually provide that element, the facade? You can incentivize both beating that performance, so you set self-sufficiency as a minimum performance, but actually that kind of tweaking of the facade over time, I think, is a great example of actually a building, Port Kai's house, where Richard was telling a story about the person in charge of the running of the building. That it actually took about 3 or 4 years to get to the performance that the kind of building was designed for. So we designed it for a certain level, but actually, as we all know, buildings are never used as we want. But that tweaking, and if you can incentivize that tweaking, and hopefully that the kind of utility service provider gets money back, either perhaps selling some of those natural resources he receives, then actually you can create more efficient infrastructure, and hopefully actually reduce the cost that the airport provider would pay in kind of installing the facade and paying for that facade. The maintenance of that asset needs to achieve a certain performance, and that OPEX of that facade is offset against the utility costs. So it's really a way of linking both the energy and water and all those other kind of elements we use to the kind of provision of those services.
Thank you, Alistair. So, the third world that we're going to talk about is called DBOM plus D. So this is design, build, operate, maintain, and we've added disassembly in there as well. So in my mind, this links to, particularly what is the entity that is going to embrace that quite sizable lifespan? Is it a joint venture of some form? What are the formal partnerships that we're going to need to establish there around the supply chain and around the operating airport? Does performance play a role in that? And how do you get that into your contracts? And how do you manage this risk and reward through structures of through the documentation and the arrangements that you strike as companies and as organisations? Yes, life cycle is absolutely fundamental to this, both that performance piece in use, but also dealing with end of life, because there'll be a legacy here that those who are part of that arrangement are going to have to deal with. It's not something that will be left to others down the line. There will be a cost there, no doubt, that will need to be addressed and dealt with. So what does this mean in terms of responses? Are they going to be tried and tested? We've done it 10 times, we know it works. Or is there going to be something that introduces technology, is more innovative and more thoughtful about, let's say, 10 years' time, 15 years' time, what are we going to be able to do and introduce into this building that enables us to generate more value or improve performance? So I think that's an important part of this aspect as well. So that requires, I guess, this aspect of flexibility to be thought about, in terms of the materials you choose and the design that you respond with. Okay, so let's hear from Andy then.
Yeah, so I think in this scenario, whole life costs will be really important to the kind of the service provider, and we might see a preference for kind of facades that maintain their performance over a long period, and we might see that the kind of use of tried and tested details and materials. But certainly durable materials that maintain their kind of visual appeal over a period of time. And materials such as bronze and copper, as you see on the background image here, which is on the core building at Eden, and bronze, which was used on Portcullis House, which Alistair mentioned, have a higher initial cost, but they have an extremely long design life and extremely durable materials. We might also start to see facades that are generating income for the client or the service provider, and one way to achieve this would be through kind of integrated advertising systems in the facade. There's lots of examples of this around London, and where these are well used, where they have a kind of good impact on the kind of the identity of the building, such as think of BFI, IMAX, and certainly in the work that we've done, thinking about the facade in this way sort of completely changes the business case. Because there's another economic consideration, and the challenge at airports being that you've also got that wayfinding requirement that you have to balance with the advertising. Because of the nature of this world, we think facade performance and monitoring and maintenance will be really important, and it might lead to kind of innovative kind of inspection methods to flag up any issues very early. And potentially like low-cost, remote-controlled maintenance bots. And certainly the facade would be designed to be able to accommodate hardware upgrades. So when performance falls below an acceptable level, the units could be replaced. So, for example, with screen resolution on the advertising screens, or the U values of the units, or with the advancement of technology and kind of PV efficiency.
And how do we see about this in a business model? I see it as the paper packs approach, that actually you're only paying for your experience, the number of people that go through your airport, and that the airport is open. A lot of it might transpire to be a facade leasing approach, something we've talked about a lot in the industry, where you'd have a long-term contract with a facade contractor. When I say long-term, the key thing we all know is that facades often get taken down after about 30 years when the glass goes. So it's making sure that the design of that actually takes it beyond there and gets them to think more than currently what's done. And then there's also contractual performance, which would be like that the airport is functioning 24/7, 365 days a year, and there'd be liquidated damages if it's not open. So you're only paying for your usage. Any lack of usage then penalises, which actually forces a great design at the beginning and this kind of ease of maintenance, maybe by robots, to kind of reduce the cost of that during the life of the facade. We also see the idea of the Internet of Things, that the facade is constantly monitored, that we know before a problem occurs that there's going to be an issue. A lot of you have probably heard about the Rolls-Royce approach to kind of aero engines, where you're constantly they are constantly monitoring their planes on a permanent basis to make sure those assets are used as hard as possible. And actually, that there isn't going to be as surprises when they land. And we think the building should be exactly the same. And with kind of technology, we think that's very achievable. We also think that if it's designed well and maintained well, that there might be a new market for kind of that operations and maintenance of that facade. So if you do a great job at the beginning and you've got a fixed rate with your airport provider, that actually there's an incentive to sell on in a secondary market for that operations and maintenance. Obviously, for the client, you're not having to pay for your facade in the first place. You're not getting all the disadvantages when the facade breaks that you're going to have to fix it. It's actually designed to have minimum implications on your operations. And obviously, at the end of life, it's not your responsibility. So you leave it with the contractor, who's obviously the best person able to take it down because you put it there in the first place. So you place risk where it's best managed.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about a universal building. So in this instance, it begins as an airport, but we expect that in future years it will convert and change to some other function. What does this mean in terms of, I guess, making that convert exercise? What does it mean in terms of layouts, in terms of dimensioning, your selection and your choices of materials, and the building services that are going to be used to light, power, heat, cool the building? I guess, Andy, what makes in this instance a facade that is reconfigurable to a building that is going to be another use than a terminal is the question that we start with here.
Yeah, in our experience, the reconfiguration of the kind of terminal building is really difficult due to kind of vertical service risers going through the building, and it limits flexibility. So this is a proposal that we did recently, which looked at a series of kind of service cassette modules that, in a similar way to the kind of I guess factory, can be deployed as kind of necessary according to the function going on inside. So each of these units could either be a kind of roof light or a solar panel or a bit of green roof, and can change accordingly. This is a concept that we came up with recently for Heathrow, and this came about through thinking about actually providing a really low energy kind of passenger environment. And it comprises of a kind of super lightweight, long span structure. And this is kind of inherently kind of highly flexible in terms of the internal environment that it creates. And terminal facilities and landside buildings are becoming much more lightweight and modular within the super enclosure. And crucially, in terms of sort of terminal design, the idea of the terminal being able to be expanded in kind of an incremental way according to the demand, passenger demand. And like Christian touched on, you have to imagine that actually a building could be completely become a whole different function, might accommodate something else altogether. And this is the Herman Miller factory, which is another Grimshaw building, and that idea of a kind of loose fit approach to the design is really important. And on this building in particular, it was in the original client brief that should be the case, and now we see that that's really what that's meant is that this building's now being converted into an academic building. So the University of Bath are moving into this building and using it as their school for art and design. And so it carries on a very long tradition of kind of industrial buildings being converted into a whole range of other functions.
So our approach is, why do you sell your airport? As airport providers, why do you need to own that kind of envelope or actually the kind of land it sits on? You might take it that you might own that kind of lightweight structure that Andy talked about, and then inside you sell off plots of land to Hilton, Gucci, Zara, or BA, and actually maintain that conditioned space, which can be reconfigurable in terms of height or width, actually allows you to not just design per passenger, but actually design per demand. I think Hilton, everyone always fights to get that hotel very close to the terminal, but actually if you could enlarge or modify to kind of allow other operators, there's potentially other revenue sources. And therefore the airport provider would just run his core assets, the things that he's good at. So focus on sort of security, baggage, air arrivals, etc. And allow all the retail experts. So I put in Unibail Rodamco, who are one of the largest shopping centre providers. If you look on the left, this is an image of a shopping centre. I think, as Richard said, it could be an airport. And actually, why don't you let the kind of shopping centre experts do their job well, and then you can reconfigure, as you see on this container, by kind of zero waste, reusable, factory-made modules. We all know of Langerock making modular housing. Why can't we have this big tent and then we just reconfigure these modules inside? Benefit of obviously the airport provider is, firstly, you're not actually paying for the airport in the first place, and you could potentially get long leases which should help you fund future expansion. That modularity allows quick changes of usage. We understand that security requirements have been changing over the last, you'll see quite significantly over the last 10 years, and so actually this kind of modular approach helps us kind of be flexible in terms of those pressures. And I guess the kind of key point is focusing on what you're good on, and if you could turn the airport into a real estate market, that's a great opportunity.
Okay, so on to the last of our future worlds, possibly the most radical one. In this case, I want you to imagine a situation where new carries a real kind of cost premium. Okay, new things cost a lot of money, so you think very carefully about buying new. And that's meant that often there's a lot of pre-used materials, refurbished components, and there's a lot of recycling going on within the production systems that are established for our built environment. In fact, there's a thriving market for this kind of stuff, and places where you perhaps can gain access to these post-consumer materials, equipment and construction components. So what does that mean in terms of the design? Well, clearly they're going to have to be durable if they're going to go through multiple cycles, because that's what would be expected of them. And they're going to need to have design responses that manage that and provide that outcome. And in terms of the materials themselves, the resource themselves, I expect there to be recycling loops that are bringing it back to create new materials and products. So when new is happening, there's a high degree of recycled content within those materials. So, Andy, the last thoughts from you, please.
Yeah, so obviously in this world, kind of component reuse is going to be a really important feature. And we think that this is going to require a kind of a much greater standardization of systems and components across the construction industry. And when I first thought of kind of standardization, I immediately thought kind of repetition and maybe stifling creativity. But I think we have a project of ours here which demonstrates that doesn't need to be the case. And this is Dulwich Science Laboratory, which we completed recently. And the façade was designed in collaboration with an artist, Peter Randall Page, and it's based on the kind of growth patterns found in nature. But interestingly, it's comprised of only 3 different kind of panel types and 5 different tile colours. So it's kind of infinitely reconfigurable into different patterns should you want to reuse it. This world also raises the question about what the future of building materials is. And if this statement is indeed true, then the idea that the scrap that we used to imagine is something else altogether, that it's 100% kind of recycled content that comes from other buildings, is something that might become a possibility. And using kind of advanced robotics, again, this idea of kind of buildings being printed, kind of broken back down into the raw material and then reprinted, becomes a kind of conceivable process. But I think the biggest thing for this one will be it will radically change our kind of approach to design. If you think about it, we'll be limited by the components that are available on the market, so we won't be able to go out and just source whatever we like. And architects will start to design buildings to be disassembled as much as they will for them to be assembled. And also the idea, I suppose, here that every item in that building will need to be kind of serialized, so it can be so it can be found and itemized. And maybe something like we start to look at the software that you were using now, like the BIM platforms. Maybe by using that, we then have a kind of searchable catalogue of materials that we'll be able to see when components are becoming available and to use them in our new buildings.
So I see that as the eBay for facades. We design a facade right at the beginning, so actually it can be demounted and resold. So you're almost taking a different perspective on kind of usage. You might have a material choice, which is all about residual value. So there was discussions earlier on about the use of coppers and other materials, which are high-value materials, which retain their value over time, rather than all these materials which are then thrown away and kind of demolished. We talked about standardisation. There's also a massive incentivization to maintain that facade, because if you want to sell off that component that's highest value, you want to make sure it's in mint condition. I love the concept of that one careful owner, the idea of buying the car, and actually with, again, this sensing of kind of components and components telling stories. So we're already looking about how we can insert sensors inside the cavities of facade to kind of spot when that problem will occur. But actually, if you can see the stress on the glues as well, then you know how much more life that component has. Because we all know they never fail in one go, they fail one by one. So actually, if you could understand how much more life is in there, you can understand much more the value. There's also, a website which I found actually exists for so Enviromate, and there's a few websites that already do it for, such as tiles and bricks that are coming off that are coming off construction sites. So these are often stuff that's left at the end, and then people are kind of selling them on. I also like the idea that an ex-Grimshaw or Arup facade might have a higher value than perhaps another element. So you might get designer second-hand elements. We talk about the antiques market, why can't we talk about facades? I think the huge benefit for clients is thinking about residual value. We always talk about writing off assets, but actually why don't we kind of say, actually at the end of its life you're going to get a load of money back, and actually someone's going to take it off you because it's worth so much. There's going to be a broker who's going to manage that process. So this, and then I guess finally you can maintain it with refurbished components, rather than actually buying new to kind of refurbish. So this kind of standardisation or kind of component side helps with that.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much, guys. So what I want to do now is, I guess, wrap up and open up a conversation with you. Hear some of your thoughts and ideas. You've heard 5 themes, five future worlds, and probably tens and tens of different ideas. It would have been a bit confusing to try and put them all down, and also not sure it would have been conducive to the discussion. But I thought we could end with perhaps just a couple of points to each of those future worlds. They might be, I think we chose these because we thought they were the most interesting, but also with a nod towards, in some instances, quite practical. Okay? But you can see there on each case, Alistair and Andy have chosen, I guess, the key thought that they considered to resonate with the future worlds that we've discussed. So what I'd like to do now is ask for your questions and ask for your thoughts around what you've heard. If you're listening in online, then please share a comment if you've got, or a question if you've got, and we'll try to introduce that. We've covered a lot of ground, and I thought I could leave this on the screen, if nothing more than just to prompt you and remind you about what you've heard. But I guess I could start maybe with just asking you whether you thought these sorts of future worlds resonated with what you're seeing, or some of the strategies that you're perhaps taking already in the work that you're doing. What do you think of them? Any thoughts?
I think the aviation world has got some particular challenges, and it is around, if I could sum it up by saying, whatever you build today, within 2 years they're going to want to start changing it, because it's a constant world of flex. But changing is very, very expensive, because you're working in an operational environment and it always costs 4 or 5 times as much as it would if you're given a greenfield site. And so I think everything we think about, particularly in terms of facades, should be within that context. That take on board the flexibility, be able to demount, remount, change things, incredibly important. I'm interested in the idea of the fact that facades have a particular lifespan, and then you've got to, the glass may be perfect, but you've got to reseal it. If you could do that with, I don't know, double facades, and so you could remove the skin of the facade so that its performance is degraded while thermal performance is degraded while you do it. You're replacing the seals and then you're removing the inner facade, and so the whole time the building operates. I think that would be a major step forward.
Yeah, just on that point as well, that's one of the nice things about the IGUS facade, is that the client just has this big sort of hex spanner and can literally just go along and take the panels off and move them themselves. It's really simple, using only one tool. So it's that kind of mechanical, and I guess thinking about how things put together, how is someone going to do it very quickly, and like you say, in an airport environment, you want to do it overnight.
Yeah.
Is really really important.
I didn't know, Alistair, whether you had, in terms of the different models you were thinking about, which talks most strongly to fast responses, if not regular change, certainly efficient change when it comes.
To be honest, I think all of that, I think it's common sense that you need to make sure in an airport environment that you can take stuff out and change it with the least disruption and minimal cost. And therefore, by thinking about that right at the beginning and making that almost as one of the main drivers, then you can reduce it 3 to or 4 to 5 times the cost that Richard talks about. I think the DBOM, where especially if you've got liquidated damages based on kind of closure of different parts of the airport, that would really focus people's minds. So that clearly states that you've got to do it, and you've got to do it well. And the robots is not. There are facades out there where they're installed by robots. I think Linda proposed something, so there isn't any reason why not.
Especially on large-scale buildings, we've done quite a lot of work recently on buildings which are very large scale, and how on earth is that maintained? And actually, that becomes a serious conversation about using robotics on kind of winches and rail systems.
I think that's why I quite like the universal, in the sense that defining that facade is the hardest thing, because that airport grows and flexes, and the idea of having this overarching effective sort of canopy, why do you have to change your environment at that first point? Well, you're prepared for it's a travel experience after all. It's sort of that notion that you're not necessarily going shopping. You've been outside. You don't need to step inside straight away, and actually it's easier to then manipulate those smaller pieces. That security that's going to grow as a separate component, I suppose. You have sort of layers of it as you go through.
What about selling your asset? Do you think, I always say, okay, we all know retail provides a lot of money for airports, but actually, shouldn't you give that to one of the shopping centre guys who are used to kind of managing those sorts of space and getting the most out of each kind of square metre of surface area, rather than people who are trying to do two things? And so there's always a compromise there. I'm not sure.
Look, it would be nice if you could choose. The passenger could choose an airport that is a shopping experience, or an airport to fly through. Get through quickly. Perhaps have different types.
And we all know hub airports are that's a bit of the challenge, is that people are hanging around for a bit, so you want to spend as much money as you can. So, yeah.
It's interesting because airports at the moment, if you take the retail space, effectively the retailer comes in and they buy the right to use a certain plan area of the thing, and then it's left up to them to create their shell and fit it out. And I think what you're saying is that actually there is a shell owner.
Yeah.
And the shell owner comes in and says, I can do one of these for you, but my interest is I know in 2 years' time you're going to want to refit, and I'm going to take that away and recycle it and bring you something else.
Which is actually quite in line with the original thinking behind the third space concept, which was we were trying to create something that was a bit more like an urban environment. So this idea that actually the different kind of structures inside maybe have different characters is much more similar to what you experience when you're kind of walking around the city than it is maybe than when you're at a conventional airport, and where it tends to be quite uniform and the standardization around everything. So could actually add to the richness of the experience.
I mean, does anybody? I mean, these worlds were designed to be slightly provocative and perhaps a little extreme. But I mean, is anybody seeing this kind of brief, I guess, coming through, or interest to see some of these ideas coming through in the work that they're doing for airports? You see this sort of, I know, some of these responses actually being applied and used because of those sorts of interests.
I think we are looking at a combination of these models. So there's elements from all of them which we would incorporate. So, for example, we look for, so Heathrow, we're trying to be carbon neutral by 2050. So inherently that means you need passive buildings that use very little energy. So that combines the first two straight away. But the only one I think maybe doesn't fit is the kind of the universal thing. Because I see, so we would design for a 50-year design life. And essentially within infrastructure, compared to other buildings, infrastructure, you can almost consider it as having no end of life, because it's there to serve societal need. So that infrastructure only gets retired or comes to its end of life when it can't meet the societal need. So the kind of the universal bit maybe doesn't work on an asset level, but it does work at maybe a system level, which is where the facade bit fits in. And so I think that the design, build, operate and maintain bit also fits in massively there as well. But the biggest challenge is the systemic business model that you have to change. So we know exactly how much passengers spend in each terminal. We know their journey times. We would know far more about an airport than a shopping centre.
Yeah.
People. But that idea of kind of servitisation and facades as a service or lighting as a service, heating as a service, I don't see why we couldn't incorporate that. The hardest thing to overcome is the fundamental transition in business model that's required.
Yeah. If I could just add a couple of things there. The portcullis house thing we were talking about, that was designed as a very low energy building for government. And there was a conversation I had with the asset manager there, and just happened to meet him at a function. And I said, how's the building performing? And he said, it's really exciting. He said, because when I came here, it really wasn't performing very well. And he said, my biggest challenge was finding an asset management company, maintenance company, who was willing to engage in improving the performance. And he said, we found these people who are really enthusiastic about it. And he said, we've been working with your guys at Arrow to tune the building. And he said, we've now beaten the original performance targets. And he said, and we're going to carry on pushing it further and further, just tweaking, making it better. And it did make me think about, there's a whole model there that says, letting it to somebody that said, we're going to pay you a rent of this much to provide us with all the energy or whatever we want to maintain our buildings. And then that company is thinking, I make profit, actually, from turning, if you think in terms of refrigerators and on efficiency rating, this building's a Class E building at the moment, I'm going to turn it into Class B, and then I'm going to rake in profit through that extra performance. And I know that some of the work we've done with you, that there are people using systems incredibly inefficiently because there's no real benefit for them to do otherwise. And it's not just you, it's most people who own buildings have no incentive to actually tweak them and get that efficiency.
I'll just come back to your point about the universal scenario, where I could see it applying in an airport context is around multi-storey car parking. So the idea that today we have a scenario where we need multi-storey car parking and there's a certain number of cars, and we don't quite know what the future of that is. We might need a lot less cars. And so the idea that you design those buildings so that they can be converted into something else, for example, commercial buildings, is an area where you might apply this concept of kind of universal design.
The interesting thing what you said is how you bring into contract this kind of performance requirements and make sure you can incentivize people to kind of beat them and to go better. And I think that is the kind of the crux of it. So all of the business models we talked about was trying to put contractual obligations to kind of and incentives to go beyond the traditional kind of build, operate and write off approach, and actually say, hey, is there any residual value? And I guess the big question is the residual value point, which I think is something that is the issue at the moment. We all know the building across from us was demolished. We saw it as a load of rubble and a load of mangled windows, and you lost all the value of that. The glass, which was perfect, it was probably single glazed. Might have been single glazed with another kind of glazing added, because I think it was a 60s building. So, but actually, how do we kind of ensure that we don't lose that and best manage it? And the kind of perception we have when we talk circular economy is that the demolition guys really know how to kind of take out value out of those assets. But when you kind of see it on site, it seems quite incredulous that there is, I guess the value is metal or kind of inert rubble, and then non-inert stuff, which costs a lot more to get rid of. And I think this is the way we need to think, that actually there is value at the end of it, and there could be a money back thing for clients, and until that's brought into the business model.
That's the difference between sort of recycling and reusing, isn't it? And if something is still in reasonable condition and easily extractable, you can reuse it. If it's kind of bonded in place, then you've got to smash it up to get it out.
That's on the point of the very first slide we said about the different scales of things. So at the moment we think about materials. There's this European project building these material banks.
Yeah.
We think of it as materials. We should actually be thinking about them as assets,
Yeah.
and then systems, and then products, and then the very last thing should be the materials. So kind of, taking your universal thing of a scrap heap, maybe, let's say we've got a building which reaches its end of life as, let's say, a passenger faces building. Well, if that can be deconstructed and used for cargo somewhere else, then actually we're using it on site. So actually we're using an asset again, because it's got, and that for me that's all about the circular economy, using things at that highest potential.
It's a little bit like when they take the 747s and turn them into cargo planes. Yeah, they punch a door into it, and it becomes.
Or hotels. I forget now what it was that they turned a plane into a hotel.
Yes, in Stockholm, in Ireland. But I actually, it was quite interesting by number 5, the scrap heap, because you mentioned eBay, and I was thinking of it, it's a bit like Oxfam or a charity shop. And you also mentioned these companies that start to do this. Where it's worked is on flooring systems. Like you can buy secondhand nice timber floor, and you can have it resurfaced, and you can reuse it, and it came out of a gymnasium or whatever. Because it's sort of something that you can install by the meter, and it can be reconfigured to another geometry, if you like. When you're talking about cladding systems, and you had that very evocative slide of all these old Edwardian windows, then it's a question of, do they meet today's performance requirements? So are they even useful?
Yep.
And it's a bit like if I'm going to go and buy an old 486 computer, like what am I going to do with it? And also, it becomes an issue of the tail wagging the dog. So now you have to tune your design to fit those systems that you just really want to reuse, which maybe, I used to work for the architect Frank Gehry, and his stuff a long time was about reusing old stuff and doing this crazy, But if you're talking about it on that scale that has the performance that you need today, unless you can do what you're talking about, which is when you're talking about replacing your Lego type pieces on your facade in your factory, maybe the ones you replace them with are newer versions of that have now a better energy performance, and they are maybe cheaper to install, but they still fit into the same socket and component system. So the difference between recycling and reusing, I think, is really important, because if you're talking about demolishing that, well, we can recycle all the steel, melt it down, and it gets, or we can grind up all the concrete and turn it into motorway or aggregate, or whereas the reuse exactly is quite difficult, unless you see almost a kind of a poetic component about why you want to do that. And then
It's an interesting thing there.
Chris, do you think
Yeah, it's about
Well,
maintenance
retail,
as well.
in aviation retail.
Indoors.
You're indoors.
Yeah.
There's there's a refit project almost every day of the calendar year. There's that much churn going on. I think the average concession is 3 years. F&B, I think it's 7. So you've got this massive rate of change. You don't suffer the part L constraints, and you've got that huge base, that huge demand for using materials. So I think that's a really exciting proposition, and you've probably got the space to store it, actually. So long as you can treat them as assets, and you can catalogue them, invent them, and understand how you find them again. But I think that would be really exciting.
I think if it's a 3D version of indoor version of your kit of parts of your factory facade, then I think that could work, because things can be moved around, and at least maybe they have a final different finish, because your Wagamama shop became then a Harrods store or
I think
something, or whatever.
bit would be your concessionaire's manual.
Yeah.
Your mandate that the tenant or concessionaire's design, a fit out, allow for disassembly, allow for cataloguing.
And they have to use that basic component system and do something with it. Yeah, that could work.
Yeah, I think we discussed is why we talked about the lease your facade, but why aren't you leasing your fan coil unit or whatever?
Yeah.
Because you've got all these things which are around the building, and why don't you just have Mitsubishi selling, like coming in and just saying, okay, well, we'll own these, we'll operate them, and then they're stored. Maybe Mitsubishi rent a hangar and kind of sell it on. But on the facade thing, I think Tale, you're about to mention maintenance of your asset, which is, I think, key, and also maintainability and upgradability of your facade. So what we always say is that, there is a question about how performance of facades are going to go. We always talk about bigger and bigger insulation units, a lot of thicknesses. But actually, can you get to that performance bit and change it quite quickly and upgrade it? And that's part of the design process. So actually, you do have something of value at the end. We've also talked about controlled cavities of facades. So rather than, airports where a lot of the higher parts of the glazing don't require any performance at all because you've got stratified air. So actually, maybe you can accept a lower performance on that huge expanse of glazing and actually just manage the cavity. And therefore, you haven't got a seal that's going to pop, and you kind of just control the condensation in there. And actually, if you just clamp the glass as well, then you can take on one with an amazing coating and swap it off for something even newer or whatever at the time that comes. But making sure things are easy to upgrade is another, what we see, real potential. So you don't become obsolete. Because I think if we all look at some of the airport buildings, we've all got the horrors of walking around airports and just saying, oh, that's looking a bit jaded. And it's making sure the shiny bit has maybe got low impact and something that you can just quickly replace. The performance bit is something quick to access. And making sure it's designed in that way that you can refurbish.
There is a cultural aspect to that, right? Because when we walk around, say, old buildings, i.e., I don't know, a church with a copper roof and it's become green.
Yeah.
Well, that looks wonderful.
Exactly.
You say it's looking jaded. Or do I walk around a 60s chair and go, God, that's starting to look yellow and older? Do I go, oh, it's got that age quality. We don't go around old Tudor buildings and go like, oh, we got to strip all that ivy off.
Yeah, exactly.
So, there's a perception about that as well. Now they're trying their damn hardest to preserve the Saarinen building in JFK.
Yeah.
They're turning it into some boutique hotel, I don't know. But there is something that suddenly there's a shift there. Now it's not outdated, now it's a classic, right?
And I think that's a great, I talk about patina in facades, and we talk about, bringing natural woods and timber and stuff that ages, and we kind of like the age of people almost touching it and it getting a stain or whatever, and that, as you say, I think you talked to us about it, Christian, about this idea that, as you say, your Victorian house has become this kind of classic kind of object that people love and therefore are kind of modifying and changing. And when you create that joy, and I think very few modern buildings do that, there's exceptions obviously to that rule, but to create the kind of, then people will change themselves and they'll reconfigure themselves to meet that just because it does something when you walk into it.
The planning system also puts restrictions on
the planning.
my own personal experiences of trying to modify Victorian houses. I guess I'm looking at the clock here and we're time's up, so I'm going to have to draw to a close. But I just briefly wanted to come back on a point I think was made by Mark from Heathrow about the business proposition. And you have this huge entity, as most operators do, which is massively complex and has cost and income coming from all sorts of different directions. And we've just talked about facades today. And we've talked about some technologies that are a little bit kooky, but others that are really practical and were done 40 years ago. And probably a bit of both is correct. And I think what will unlock this is understanding that business model proposition, and tweaking the levers and tweaking the numbers in that to see at which point something tips into being practical today. So I mean, it's quite complex at that level. But certainly within the silos or the disciplines, within the update processes that exist there, I think if you start to test these by looking at the costs and the benefits from them and the opportunity around what you're not doing at the moment, but if you did something differently, it might make another income stream. I think that's probably quite an interesting place to start, because I think there's a lot of technology and a lot of materials and a lot of design capability that can do this now, quite frankly. What we don't know, though, is about the future and how we'll be flying and how we'll be moving around in 25, 30, 40 years' time. So I'm going to bring it to a close. I hope you enjoyed the conversation today. Certainly thank you for attending, and for those of you online for patching in as well. These slides are going to be, I think it's been recorded, and it's available or will be uploaded to the Disruption Innovation Festival website at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation over the course of the next couple of weeks. So you can dip back into it and share it with your colleagues and friends if you would like to. But I guess that draws it to a close. Thank you very much.